All of your public comments don't talk about meritocracy. They talk about liberal democratic efforts that are destroying the military, that those people are our enemies. That's not meritocracy. That's a political view. And your goal, as I see emerging, is to politicize the military in favor of your particular positions, which you've outlined extensively, which would be the worst blow to the professionalism of the United States military and would undercut readiness, undercut retention, because I can see officers receiving these emails beginning to wonder very seriously if they should continue. Let me change subject for a moment here.
This exchange matters far more than it first appears, and not because of a single sharp question or a heated line. It matters because it exposes a fundamental conflict over what the U.S. military is supposed to be and who it is supposed to serve.
Thank you. You're a very understanding chairman. I like that. I like that. Ms. Hegseth, you've written, and it's quote, "Oh yeah, and fire any general who hasn't carried water for Obama and Biden's extra constitution and agenda-driven transformation for our military. Clean house and start over." It's come to my attention that current serving military personnel have received emails threatening them with being fired for supporting the current DoD policies. One mail that was sent to a military officer with the subject line, "Clean house," reminiscent of your specific comment, states, and I quote, "With the incoming administration looking to remove disloyal, corrupt, traitorous, liberal officers such as yourself, we will certainly be putting your name into the list of those personnel to be removed. We know you support the woke DEI policies and will ensure you never again influence anyone in the future. You and the redacted spouse's name will be lucky if you're able to collect your military requirement," end quote. Now, I want to remind everyone that these policies that are being referred to date back decades, to the 1940s and 50s with respect to racial discrimination particularly, and administrations of both parties, including the Trump administration and their first party, caused those policies to be enforced. Mr. Hegseth, are you aware of these emails being sent to officers?
Senator, you mentioned the word accountability, which is something we have not had for the last 4 years.
Are you aware of these messages being sent to officers?
Certainly I'm not aware of that. It's not one of my efforts, but there's been no accountability for the disaster of the withdrawal in Afghanistan. And that's precisely why we're here today.
Excuse me.
Is that leadership has been unwilling to take accountability. It's the time to restore that to our most senior ranks.
You've written publicly that DEI policy is a distraction and have military personnel walking on eggshells. Do you believe that emails like that, that are essentially threatening both a serving officer and a spouse and claiming that they'll lose their pension, will have a distraction and detract from the lethality?
Senator, you mentioned the 40s and 50s, and you're precisely right. The military was a forerunner in courageous racial integration in ways no other institutions were willing to do. I served with men and women of all backgrounds because of the courage of people decades and decades ago. Incredibly important. However, the DEI policies of today are not the same as what happened back then. They're dividing troops inside formations, causing commanders to walk on eggshells, not putting meritocracy first. That's the indictment that's made by those serving right now.
Excuse me.
And why we're having this conversation.
All of your public comments don't talk about meritocracy. They talk about liberal democratic efforts that are destroying the military, that those people are our enemies. That's not meritocracy. That's a political view. And your goal, as I see emerging, is to politicize the military in favor of your particular positions, which you've outlined extensively, which would be the worst blow to the professionalism of the United States military and would undercut readiness, undercut retention, because I can see officers receiving these emails beginning to wonder very seriously if they should continue. let me change subject for a moment here. You've been instrumental in securing pardons for several convicted war criminals. In at least two of these cases, the military personnel who served in combat with these convicted service members were not supportive of the pardons. They did their duty as soldiers to report war crimes. Your definition of lethality seems to embrace those people who do commit war crimes, rather than those who stand up and say, this is not right. So what's the response to your service members who personally witnessed these and courageously reported them to their superiors?
Senator, as someone who's led men in combat directly and had to make very difficult decisions, I've thought very deeply about the balance between legality and lethality, ensuring that the men and women on the front lines have the opportunity to destroy with and close the enemy, and that lawyers aren't the ones getting in the way. I'm not talking about disavowing the laws of war or the Geneva Conventions or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Sir, I'm talking about restrictive rules of engagement that these men and women behind me understand they've lived with on the battlefield, which has made it more difficult to defeat our enemies. In many of the cases you're talking about in particular, sir, there was evidence withheld, there was prosecutorial misconduct, and as someone who looks case by case and defaults to the warfighter, to the men and women with dust on their boots, not the second guessers in air-conditioned offices in Washington, D.C.
Excuse me.
I look case by case and was proud to work with President Trump to understand those cases and ensure that our warriors are always looked out for.
Those cases were adjudicated by who? People in Washington or fellow non-commissioned officers who had also served, sacrificed, and believed in the ethic of the military? Who were the court-martial?
Senator, in multiple cases, they were actually acquitted, but
some
charges
cases,
lingered.
yes,
regardless of where those convening authorities were, yes, sir.
Some were, but others were convicted, and you asked for pardon. That's the only reason you asked for pardon, because they were convicted. But the other factor, too, is you've already disparaged in writing the Geneva Convention, the rules of law, all of these things. How will you be able to effectively lead a military in which one of the principal elements is discipline, respect for lawful authority? You have made statements to your platoon after being briefed by a JAG officer. Well, by the way, would you explain what a JAG-off is?
I don't think I need to, sir.
Why not?
Because the men and women watching understand.
Well, perhaps some of my colleagues don't understand.
It would be a JAG officer who puts his or her own priorities in front of the warfighters. Their promotions, their medals, in front of having the backs of those who are making the tough calls on the front lines.
Thank you, Senator Reid.
Interesting.
Thank you, Senator
Thank
Reid.
you very much.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr.
When Jack Reed begins by reading that email aloud, he isn't trying to shock the room. He's establishing something much more serious: real-world consequences. This isn't abstract rhetoric on a cable news set. This is a serving military officer receiving a message that threatens their career, their pension, and even drags their spouse into the crosshairs. Reed wants everyone watching to understand that language has gravity, especially when it comes from figures who influence public opinion and policy. And that's why Reed deliberately connects the email's phrasing to Pete Hegseth's own words: clean house, disloyal, traitorous. These aren't neutral descriptors. In a military structure built on trust, hierarchy, and lawful authority, those words signal something dangerous: that political alignment, not professional conduct, is becoming the test of loyalty. Reed then takes viewers back in time, not to deflect, but to educate. DEI policies in the military didn't begin as a modern cultural experiment. They originated during the 1940s and 1950s, when the U.S. military made the decision to integrate racially before much of the country was ready to do so. That wasn't wokeness. It was a recognition that discrimination weakens fighting forces, undermines cohesion, and damages morale. And crucially, those policies were upheld across Republican and Democratic administrations alike, including Trump's. This historical framing matters because it undercuts the idea that these policies are partisan inventions. Reed is reminding the audience that inclusion in the military has always been about effectiveness, not ideology. When Reed asks whether Hegseth is aware of the threatening emails, the response is telling. Hegseth doesn't condemn them. He doesn't express concern for the officer involved. Instead, he pivots immediately to Afghanistan and accountability. That pivot is the first major reveal of the exchange. Reed isn't denying failures in Afghanistan. What he's highlighting is something deeper. Accountability is not selective. You don't get to demand accountability upward while tolerating intimidation downward. A military cannot function if junior and mid-level officers begin to believe their careers depend on political purity rather than lawful service. This is where Reed's argument becomes structural, not emotional. He explains that when officers receive messages like this, they don't just feel offended, they start calculating risk. Do I speak up? Do I stay silent? Do I leave the service altogether? Over time, that erodes retention, damages readiness, and hollows out leadership from the inside. That's not theory, that's how institutions decay. Hegseth's response about DEI being divisive introduces a second fault line. He frames modern diversity efforts as distractions that force commanders to walk on eggshells. Reed dismantles this not by debating DEI slogans, but by pointing out what Hegseth's public rhetoric actually does. It doesn't argue for merit-based promotion. It labels fellow service members as ideological enemies. And once that line is crossed, the military stops being professional and starts being political. That is Reed's central warning. Politicizing the military is far more dangerous than any diversity training session ever could be. Then the conversation shifts, and the stakes rise further. Reed brings up war crimes, and this is not accidental. Accountability inside the military doesn't stop at personnel policies. It extends to the battlefield itself. Reed reminds viewers that Hegseth actively advocated for pardons in cases where service members were convicted of war crimes, even when fellow soldiers who served alongside them reported those crimes in good faith. This is where Reed reframes the word lethality. True lethality isn't just about pulling the trigger. It's about discipline under fire. It's about following lawful orders, even when it's hard. And it's about protecting the moral legitimacy of the force so that soldiers aren't turned into liabilities by their own leadership. Hegseth's response draws a sharp contrast in worldview. He positions lawyers and rules of engagement as obstacles. He emphasizes battlefield instincts over legal oversight. And while he claims he isn't rejecting the Geneva Conventions or military law, his framing consistently treats those safeguards as inconveniences rather than foundations. Reed presses again, clarifying something many viewers may not fully appreciate. These cases weren't decided by detached politicians in Washington. They were adjudicated by military courts, often involving non-commissioned officers and fellow service members who understood combat, sacrifice, and the ethical obligations of service. When someone is convicted under that system, it isn't a casual judgment. The exchange over JAG officers crystallizes everything. JAGs exist to ensure discipline, legality, and command integrity. Disparaging them isn't toughness, it's contempt for the very mechanisms that prevent chaos in war. Reed doesn't need to argue this loudly. The implication is self-evident. A military that sidelines its legal framework doesn't become stronger, it becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability, especially in armed force, is a liability to the nation it serves. This is why the exchange feels so tense. It's not about personalities, it's about whether the U.S. military remains an apolitical institution governed by law, or whether it drifts toward ideological loyalty tests and selective accountability. And that's the lesson viewers should take away. Strong militaries aren't defined by how aggressively they talk about strength. They're defined by discipline, restraint, and trust in the systems that govern force. When those systems are undermined, everyone loses, including the people on the front lines. If this helped clarify what was really happening beneath the surface of this exchange, take a moment to engage, share your perspective, ask questions, and let others know how you see it. These conversations matter because the future of military professionalism depends on whether accountability is treated as a burden or as the backbone of leadership. Now tell me what stood out to you most in this exchange, and whether you think this line of questioning revealed a deeper problem that deserves more scrutiny.